Japanese industry collapsed under America's B-29 bombing raids. In 1945, by early 1944, the Pacific War had reached a critical turning point. The United States had clawed its way across the Pacific, seizing islands from Guadalcanal to Saipan in a bloody island-hopping campaign. Each battle had been fought with extraordinary cost, but every mile gained brought American airfields closer to the Japanese homeland. For years, Japan's cities, factories, and infrastructure had remained relatively untouched by aerial bombardment. The Japanese military had fought ferociously across Asia and the Pacific, shielded by the vast distances of the ocean and by an air defense system focused on protecting the home islands. While American submarines strangled Japan's shipping lanes, the industrial heart of the empire remained largely intact. That began to change with the arrival of a machine unlike anything the world had ever seen: the B-29 Superfortress. The birth of the Superfortress. The Boeing B-29 was the most advanced bomber of World War II. Developed at enormous cost, more than $3 billion, surpassing even the Manhattan Project, the aircraft represented the pinnacle of American industrial and technological might. Features that set it apart included a pressurized cabin, allowing high-altitude flight beyond the reach of most Japanese interceptors. Remote-controlled gun turrets, each armed with heavy .50-caliber machine guns. Enormous range, capable of flying over 3,000 miles. A bomb capacity of nearly 20,000 pounds, double that of the famous B-17 Flying Fortress. Nicknamed the Superfortress, it was designed for one purpose: to deliver destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. Saipan and the opening of the skies, the capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, in the summer of 1944, gave the United States the airfields it needed to unleash the B-29 directly on Japan. From these bases, located just 1,500 miles from Tokyo, the Superfortress could strike at the industrial centers that sustained the Japanese war machine. The Japanese had feared this possibility for years. With the Marianas in American hands, that fear became reality. Entire cities now lay within reach of American bomb bays. The first missions. In November 1944, the first B-29s lifted off from newly constructed airstrips on Saipan. Their targets were Japan's aircraft factories, steel mills, and shipyards. Flying at high altitudes, the bombers faced intense anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Japanese fighters. The missions were plagued with problems. High-altitude bombing proved inaccurate. Jet streams scattered bombs far from their intended targets. Mechanical failures and pilot inexperience took a heavy toll. Losses mounted, and initial results were disappointing. Yet the B-29 represented more than just bombs dropped. It represented inevitability. For the first time, Japan's heartland was within striking distance of relentless, sustained bombardment. The arrival of Curtis LeMay, in January 1945, command of the B-29 campaign passed to Major General Curtis E. LeMay, a man whose ruthless efficiency would change the face of warfare. LeMay, a master of strategic bombing, was unimpressed with the early failures of the Superfortress campaign. He recognized the problem immediately. High-altitude precision bombing was unreliable against Japan's dispersed, lightly constructed industrial facilities. LeMay proposed a radical shift in tactics. Instead of targeting factories with precision bombs at 30,000 feet, the B-29s would fly low-altitude night missions, carrying incendiary bombs designed to ignite the wooden structures that dominated Japanese cities. It was a strategy aimed not just at industry, but at the very fabric of urban life. The stage is set. By February 1945, the American war machine was in full swing. The Philippines had been retaken. Iwo Jima was under siege, soon to fall and provide an emergency landing strip for crippled bombers. The U.S. Navy dominated the seas, and American carriers roamed with impunity. All that remained was to strike the killing blows against Japan's industrial and psychological capacity to wage war. The B-29, guided by LeMay's brutal doctrine, would be the hammer. Japanese industry in 1945. To understand the impact of what was about to unfold, one must understand Japan's wartime economy. Unlike Germany, which relied on massive industrial plants, Japan's industry was dispersed across countless small workshops, often located in residential neighborhoods. Families worked in cottage industries producing parts for planes, weapons, and vehicles. This system made high-altitude bombing ineffective. Destroying one factory did little when production was spread across thousands of wooden buildings. But it also made Japan uniquely vulnerable to incendiary bombing. Fire, once unleashed, would not only destroy homes, but also the very workshops that sustained the war. The first fire raids. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, LeMay's new strategy was unleashed. Over 300 B-29s roared toward Tokyo, flying low at 5,000 to 8,000 feet. Their bomb bays were filled not with conventional explosives, but with napalm-filled incendiary canisters. What followed was one of the most devastating air raids in history. The bombs ignited a firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of Tokyo. Entire neighborhoods vanished in waves of flame. The city's wooden houses became tinder, the fire leaping from block to block in an unstoppable inferno. Estimates of the dead ranged from 80,000 to over 100,000, more than the number killed in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Over 1 million were left homeless. Tokyo was not alone. In the following weeks, B-29s firebombed Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities. By the summer of 1945, nearly every major Japanese urban center lay in ruins. The collapse begins, the effects on. Japanese industry were catastrophic. Entire supply chains disappeared overnight. Railroads twisted in the heat, warehouses collapsed, and workshops burned to ashes. With raw materials already scarce due to the Allied blockade, Japan's ability to produce aircraft, ships, and weapons plummeted. Even more devastating was the impact on morale. Civilians, once insulated from the front lines, now lived under constant terror. Night after night, the skies filled with the drone of superfortresses, followed by the shriek of sirens and the roar of flames. Families fled into rivers, canals, and fields, desperate to escape the infernos. The psychological blow was immense. For the first time in centuries, the Japanese homeland itself was under direct, relentless assault. American industry versus Japanese survival. While Japan burned, America's industrial juggernaut only accelerated. The United States could build B-29s faster than Japan could shoot them down. Factories in Kansas and Nebraska churned out planes in assembly line fashion. Crews were trained by the thousands. For every bomber lost, 2 more took its place. For every bomb dropped, America produced 1,000 more. Japan, isolated, starved of resources, and battered by submarine warfare, could not compete. By mid-1945, Japanese aircraft production had collapsed by more than 60%. Shipbuilding was paralyzed. Transportation networks lay in ruins. The empire was collapsing from within. As the fire raids continued, the world inched closer to the war's most controversial conclusion. The B-29 was more than a bomber. It was also the delivery system for a weapon that would redefine humanity's relationship with war, the atomic bomb. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would follow in the final chapter. But even before the mushroom clouds rose, Japan's fate was sealed. Its cities had been reduced to ash, its industry crippled and cheered, and its people broken under the ceaseless weight of American firepower. And at the center of this devastation stood the B-29 Superfortress, the machine that carried industrial war to Japan's doorstep. The night Tokyo burned. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, war reached its most apocalyptic crescendo yet. More than 330 B-29 superfortresses, their bellies filled with incendiary bombs, took off from airstrips in the Marianas. Their target was not a single factory, dockyard, or airfield. Their target was Tokyo itself, the beating heart of the Japanese Empire. Curtis LeMay, the American commander, had stripped away the old doctrine of high-altitude precision. He ordered his bombers low, just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, where Japanese radar and night fighters were less effective. In their bays were M69 incendiary bomblets, small canisters filled with gelid gasoline. Each cluster could scatter dozens of firebombs over a wide area, designed not to blast, but to burn. At 12:08 a.m., the first Pathfinders released their loads. Within minutes, Tokyo's eastern wards lit up like a furnace. Thousands of wooden homes, built tightly together, their paper walls and tatami mats bone dry, caught fire instantly. The flames leapt from rooftop to rooftop, carried by a strong night wind. Within an hour, Tokyo was an inferno. A city of fire. Civilians poured into the streets in panic, clutching children, dragging bundles of possessions. Yet there was nowhere to run. The firestorm devoured entire neighborhoods in minutes. Roads became rivers of flame. Bridges collapsed into canals already clogged with corpses. Eyewitnesses described the sound as a roar louder than thunder, a wall of flame that sucked the air from lungs and lifted people off their feet. Those who fled into the rivers and canals found the water boiling, their bodies seared alive. Others suffocated as the firestorm consumed oxygen, collapsing where they stood. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to ash. The official death toll was over 83,000, though many historians believe the true figure exceeded 100,000. More than 1 million were left homeless. It was the single deadliest air raid in human history, surpassing even Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The aftermath in Tokyo. When the fires died, survivors stumbled through a landscape of horror. The city centre was unrecognizable. Landmarks had vanished, neighborhoods erased. Corpses lay in the streets, charred beyond recognition, stacked in piles like kindling. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Fire brigades had been obliterated along with their stations. Hospitals overflowed with the burned and the dying, but medicines and doctors were scarce. Families wandered among the ruins, searching for loved ones they would never find. For the Japanese government, the raid was a disaster beyond comprehension. Factories had vanished, workshops gone. Thousands of small cottage industries, women weaving cloth, families assembling aircraft parts, were destroyed in a single night. Tokyo's ability to function as a capital city had been crippled. LeMay's campaign expands. General LeMay was not finished. Tokyo was only the beginning. Over the next weeks, he unleashed Operation Meeting House across Japan's cities. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all burned in turn. Each raid involved hundreds of B-29s, each dropping tons of incendiaries. By the end of March 1945, dozens of Japanese cities lay in ruins. In April, the raids intensified. On some nights, American bombers struck multiple cities in a single mission. By June, 58 cities had been devastated. The statistics are staggering. By war's end, 40% of Japan's urban area was destroyed. More than 2 million homes had been burned. At least 330,000 civilians were killed by firebombing alone. Japan's industrial base, built into those same cities, collapsed along with them. The collapse of industry, the firebombing campaign, was not simply an act of terror. It was a calculated strategy aimed at destroying Japan's war-making capacity. Unlike Germany, many whose industry centered on large factories, Japan's production was decentralized. Weapons, aircraft, and parts were often made in small neighborhood workshops, many housed in residential buildings. When fire swept through cities, it destroyed both homes and the workshops within them. The result was catastrophic. Aircraft production dropped by more than half between March and July 1945. Shipbuilding, already crippled by US submarines, became impossible as dockyards burned. Ammunition and weapons output plummeted as supply chains collapsed. Even transportation buckled. The bombings destroyed railroads, twisted steel tracks into useless shapes, and leveled stations. Moving raw materials, fuel, or food became nearly impossible. By summer 1945, Japan's economy was on life support. Life for civilians, for ordinary Japanese civilians, life became a nightmare of hunger, fear, and loss. Every night brought the threat of new raids. Families fled to the countryside if they could, abandoning the smouldering ruins of cities. Those who remained endured ceaseless hardship. Food shortages became severe as transportation collapsed. Rice, the staple diet, was replaced by barley, sweet potatoes, or even grass and roots. Malnutrition spread, particularly among children. Air raid shelters offered little safety. Most were simple holes dug into the earth, which collapsed in firestorms or suffocated their occupants. Survivors recalled entire families entombed in shelters that became ovens when flames passed overhead. For many, the raids were not just physical destruction, but psychological torture. The once invincible empire was being burned alive before their eyes. Japanese leadership in denial. Even as city after city vanished in firestorms, Japan's military leadership clung to hope. They believed that massive civilian casualties would stiffen national resistance, that the people would fight to the death rather than surrender. But morale was cracking. Diaries recovered after the war revealed despair among civilians. One entry from April 1945 read, "Last night the sky burned red again. My neighbor's house is gone. My children cry each time the sirens sound. We are told to endure, but what is left to endure for? Soon there will be nothing but ashes." This collapse of will was exactly what LeMay had intended. By making survival impossible, he sought to force Japan into surrender without an invasion. The ironies of war. Ironically, while American bombers burned Japan's cities, American planners were preparing for an invasion of the home islands. Operation Downfall, the planned assault, projected casualties in the millions. The firebombing campaign was justified in part as a way to weaken Japan before that invasion. Yet some questioned the morality. Even among Allied leaders, doubts grew about the sheer scale of civilian suffering. The Tokyo raid alone had killed more than the atomic bombings would later claim. But in the brutal calculus of total war, LeMay and his superiors believed the raids saved lives in the long run by hastening Japan's collapse. Survivors' voices. Testimonies from survivors paint the most vivid picture of what those nights were like. Keiko Ikeda, a Tokyo schoolgirl, recalled, "The sky was filled with red light. The heat was unbearable. I tried to run, but the fire moved faster than my legs. I saw people fall, their clothes burning. I hid in a canal, but the water boiled. My skin blistered. When I climbed out, the world was gone." Shigeo Nagashima, a factory worker, wrote, "I searched for my wife and children after the raid. I found only ashes where our home had been. I never saw them again. All around me were bodies, blackened and twisted. I walked for hours, not knowing where to go, because there was no Tokyo anymore." These voices remind us that behind statistics lay millions of shattered lives. America's relentless advance. While the B-29s burned Japan's cities, American ground forces continued their advance. Iwo Jima fell in March, providing an emergency landing base for damaged bombers. In April, Okinawa was invaded, a battle of such ferocity it foreshadowed what an invasion of Japan itself might entail. From Okinawa, American bombers had even shorter range to Japan. The raids only increased in intensity. By summer 1945, Japanese cities resembled moonscapes. The point of no return. By July, it was clear Japan's industrial collapse was nearly total. Production of aircraft engines fell to a fraction of earlier levels. Transportation of coal, oil, and food had nearly ceased. Starvation loomed. Yet the government still refused unconditional surrender. Military leaders prepared for a final defense of the home islands, stockpiling weapons and training civilians to resist invasion with bamboo spears. The irony was tragic. Japan was already broken, yet its leaders clung to the illusion of survival. The firebombing had done its work. The empire was ashes, the ashes of industry. By the summer of 1945, Japan's once ambitious industrial empire lay in ruins. The nation that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor with grand visions of Pacific domination now struggled to produce even the most basic war materials. The firebombing campaign had not only destroyed factories, but had also unraveled the very network that held Japanese industry together. For an industrial machine to function, it requires three pillars: raw materials, production centers, and transportation. By mid-1945, all three had been crippled beyond repair. Raw materials: submarines and blockades strangled imports. Oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber from Southeast Asia were cut off. Production centers, cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe had been burned to the ground. Transportation: the railroads, roads, and shipping that connected industry to military fronts had been shattered by B-29s and US submarines. This was not just damage, it was collapse. The railroad nightmare: Japan's transportation network was heavily dependent on railroads. Coal from Hokkaido, iron from Manchuria, and food from rural provinces had to move by train. Yet the relentless bombing campaigns turned this lifeline into a graveyard of twisted steel. High-explosive raids targeted rail yards, junctions, and bridges. Locomotives were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Wooden freight cars burned in firestorms, their loads reduced to ashes. Even when tracks remained intact, fires and rubble from surrounding neighborhoods blocked access. Trains stalled in tunnels or on open lines, easy prey for low-flying American fighters. By July 1945, many regions of Japan faced rail paralysis. Food and coal piled up uselessly in rural depots, unable to reach the starving cities. The collapse of shipping, equally devastating, was the destruction of Japan's merchant marine. At the war's saint, Japan possessed a fleet of over 6 million tons of shipping. By 1945, less than 2 million tons remained, much of it immobilized in port due to fuel shortages or sunk outright by American submarines and aircraft. Tankers carrying oil were hunted ruthlessly. Cargo ships moving food from Korea, Formosa, and China vanished beneath the waves. Even fishing fleets, once vital for supplementing food supplies, could no longer risk venturing far from shore. Japan, an island nation utterly dependent on imports, faced starvation. Industry without power, factories that survived the firebombings were crippled by another problem: fuel. Coal shipments dwindled, oil was virtually non-existent, electricity shortages left machines idle. In Tokyo, factories operated at less than 20% capacity by July 1945. Assembly lines halted not just for lack of materials, but because workers were dead, displaced, or too weak from hunger to continue. Women and children conscripted to work in neighborhood workshops sat idle as the materials they were supposed to assemble never arrived. This paralysis spread across every sector. Aircraft. By 1945, production of fighters like the Zero had dropped by 75%. Ships. New warships were virtually non-existent. Japan could not replace losses. Ammunition. Stockpiles dwindled as factories fell silent. The empire that once prided itself on industrial miracles had ground to a halt. The hunger crisis, perhaps the most devastating consequence of industrial collapse, was the famine that loomed over Japan in 1945. With shipping sunk and railroads in ruins, food could not reach the cities. Rice, once a staple, became scarce. Families survived on barley, millet, or whatever could be scavenged. In Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, malnutrition became rampant. Children's bellies swelled from hunger. Adults lost weight rapidly. Reports described people fainting on streets, too weak to walk. The Japanese government tried to conceal the extent of the crisis, but diaries and testimonies revealed desperation. A mother in Osaka wrote, "We boil weeds and tree bark. The children cry at night from hunger. I tell them to sleep, but they cannot. Their stomachs hurt too much." A soldier home on leave recalled, "I saw more suffering in the streets of Tokyo than on the front. Skeletons walking, mothers with no milk for their babies." This was no longer a nation at war. It was a nation starving to death. The firebombing had not just destroyed cities, it had cut the arteries that fed them. Civilians under siege. Every night, Japanese civilians looked to the sky with dread. The drone of B-29 engines became a sound of terror. Sirens wailed, shelters filled, and firestorms followed. By July 1945, most major cities had been attacked. Some, like Toyama, were virtually erased in a single raid, 99% of the city destroyed. Others, like Nagoya, endured multiple firebombings until nothing recognizable remained. Families lived like nomads, moving from one ruined shelter to another. Schools no longer functioned. Hospitals overflowed. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded shelters where sanitation collapsed. Even morale, a cornerstone of Japan's wartime propaganda, cracked under the relentless assault. Once told to endure with stoic bravery, civilians now whispered doubts. Letters intercepted by American intelligence revealed despair and anger at a government that could not protect them. The psychological war. The bombing campaign was not merely physical, it was psychological. LeMay's strategy aimed to break Japan's will to fight by making survival itself impossible. Leaflets dropped from B-29s warned civilians to evacuate cities, listing targets for the next raids. For some, this was seen as psychological torment, forcing them to flee in terror. For others, it was proof of America's overwhelming power, as if the enemy could dictate Japan's fate at will. By the summer, fear dominated daily life. Children cowered at the sound of airplanes. Families dug shallow holes in fields, praying flames would pass them by. Entire communities vanished in silence, replaced by smoking craters. The military's desperation, Japan's military, once confident of victory, now faced reality. Without industry, their armies could not fight. Without fuel, their navy could not sail. Without food, their people could not endure. Yet surrender remained unthinkable to many leaders. They planned for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the home islands. Millions of civilians were conscripted, trained with bamboo spears, and drilled to resist invasion to the death. It was a grim paradox. While the nation starved, leaders still envisioned a final apocalyptic battle. America's relentless machine. On the other side of the Pacific, American industry roared at full strength. The United States produced B-29s faster than Japan could shoot them down. By mid-1945, over 1,600 superfortresses were deployed in the Pacific. Each mission involved hundreds of planes, dropping thousands of tons of bombs. In a single night, more destruction could be unleashed than Japan's entire air force could inflict in months. For every B-29 lost, 3 more were built. For every pilot killed, another crew trained. America's capacity seemed limitless, Japan's non-existent. Survivor accounts, first-hand voices illustrate the depth of Japan's collapse. Yoshiko Tanaka, a housewife in Nagoya. "We had nothing left. Each night we dug holes in the ground and prayed the fire would not find us. My husband worked in a factory, but there was no work. He came home with empty hands. We starved together." Kiyoshi Sato, a railway worker. "I watched trains loaded with food rot in the yards. The tracks were gone, the engines broke. And people begged us for rice, but we could not deliver it. The war had eaten everything. Hideki Matsumoto, a teenager. I saw my city burn. I saw my school collapse. I saw my sister die in the fire. And yet the radio told us we were winning. I knew then the war was lies. The numbers of destruction. By July 1945, the statistics painted the clearest picture: 58. Major cities bombed, 40% of urban Japan destroyed, 130,000 civilians killed by conventional raids, million homes destroyed, industry reduced to less than 30% capacity. Japan was not merely losing the war, it was ceasing to function as a modern state. The world watches. Globally, observers recognized that Japan was on the brink. Allied leaders debated how much more punishment was necessary before surrender. Some argued that continued firebombing would suffice. Others pointed toward the Manhattan Project, preparing to unleash a weapon of unprecedented magnitude. Yet to those who walked the ruins of Tokyo, Osaka, or Kobe, it was clear that Japan's industrial and civilian collapse was nearly absolute. A nation on the edge. By August 1945, Japan teetered on the edge of starvation, ruin, and despair. Industry had collapsed, transportation had failed, and millions were homeless. The firebombing had achieved what it set out to do: reduce Japan to ashes. But the final chapter of destruction had yet to be written. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the B-29 would deliver not firestorms of napalm, but the dawn of the atomic age. The stage of destruction. By the beginning of August 1945, Japan was a nation standing in ruins. Its great cities were heaps of ash, its factories silent, its railroads broken, and its people starving. The firebombing campaign of B-29s had consumed Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other urban centers. Industry had collapsed, transportation was paralyzed, civilian morale was shattered. Yet Japan's leaders still refused to surrender. Even as children starved in the streets, the Supreme War Council, the so-called Big Six, debated how to continue. Their hope was that if they held out long enough, they could negotiate conditional peace through Soviet mediation. They still dreamed of preserving the emperor, avoiding occupation, and retaining some vestige of honor. But America was preparing to deliver a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Manhattan Project. For years, in secret laboratories across the United States, scientists had labored on the Manhattan Project. With a budget larger than the entire automobile industry, this vast program sought to unlock the destructive power of the atom. By July 1945, it had succeeded. On July 16th, in the desert of New Mexico, the first atomic bomb was detonated. The fireball rose brighter than the sun, the shockwave shattering windows miles away. The world had entered a new age. President Harry S. Truman, newly arrived from the San Francisco Conference and now at Potsdam with Churchill and Stalin, was informed of the test's success. He immediately saw its implications. Not only would the atomic bomb force Japan's surrender, it would also send a message to the Soviet Union about America's post-war power. Choosing the targets, the US military compiled a list of Japanese cities to be considered for atomic attack. Kyoto, with its cultural heritage, was spared at the urging of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Instead, the final choices were Hiroshima, a major military and industrial hub, and Nagasaki, a port with shipbuilding and munitions industries. The weapon would be delivered by the very machine that had already reduced Japan's cities to ash, the B-29 Superfortress. Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. At 2:45 a.m., the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, lifted off from Tinian Island. In its bomb bay was Little Boy, a uranium-based atomic bomb. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released over Hiroshima. 43 seconds later, a blinding flash split the sky. The bomb exploded with the force of 15 kilotons of TNT. A fireball 1,000 feet wide incinerated the city center. Temperatures reached 5,000 degrees Celsius. Human shadows were seared into stone walls. Wooden houses vanished instantly. Within seconds, 70,000 people were dead. Tens of thousands more would die in the following weeks from burns and radiation. The once vibrant city was reduced to a flat, smoking wasteland. Nagasaki, August 9, 1945. 3 days later, on August 9, another B-29 boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, approached Japan with Fat Man, a plutonium-based bomb. Its primary target, Kokura, was obscured by clouds. The plane diverted to its secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated. The bomb exploded in a valley, limiting its blast radius but still unleashing devastation. Factories and homes disintegrated. The Mitsubishi arms plant was obliterated. At least 40,000 died instantly. Thousands more perished from burns and radiation sickness in the days that followed. In less than 1 week, 2 cities had been erased by weapons beyond imagination. Japan's leadership in sea. Crisis. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stunned Japan's leaders. Yet even then, surrender was not unanimous. Army hardliners insisted on continuing the fight, hoping to inflict such casualties on an Allied invasion that they could negotiate better terms. But Emperor Hirohito himself intervened. For the first time in the war, he broke with tradition and addressed the Supreme Council directly. He declared that the suffering of his people had become intolerable and that Japan must endure the unendurable and surrender. On August 15, 1945, his voice was broadcast to the Japanese people in a recorded radio address, the first time they had ever heard their emperor speak. In solemn tones, he told them Japan must accept defeat, the role of the B-29. The irony of history is that the same aircraft, the B-29 Superfortress, had carried both the conventional firebombs that leveled Tokyo and the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No other weapons system in the war had such a direct role in shaping history. From March to August 1945, the B-29 had reduced Japan's cities to ash, strangled its industry, starved its people, and finally delivered the atomic age itself. The human toll, by the time Japan surrendered, the scale of destruction was almost beyond comprehension. 30,000 killed in firebombing raids, and 20,000 killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki by year's end, 2.5 million homes destroyed. 40% of urban Japan reduced to ruins. Industrial output collapsed by over 70%. Millions more were left homeless, starving, and diseased. Japan had ceased to function as a modern nation. Survivors' testimonies. The most haunting accounts come from survivors of the bombings. Shigeko Sasamori, a Hiroshima schoolgirl, recalled, "The flash was so bright I thought the sun had fallen. My skin hung from my arms like rags. All around me people cried, burned, begging for water. There was no water, only fire." Nagasaki. Dr. Tatsuichiro Akizuki wrote, "Patients came with skin burned black, eyes melted shut, their bodies swollen. We had no medicine. We watched them die, one after another, unable to help." Such voices reveal the human reality behind statistics, the agony endured by ordinary people caught in the firestorm of history. The legacy of collapse. Japan's surrender ended World War II, but the legacy of the B-29 bombing campaign remains profound. It demonstrated the devastating power of strategic bombing. It showed that modern war could target not only armies but entire societies. And with the atomic bombings, it introduced humanity to the nuclear age. For Japan, the collapse of industry was total. Factories were gone, shipping destroyed, railroads ruined. The economy would take decades to recover. Yet from the ashes, post-war Japan would rebuild into one of the world's most advanced industrial powers, a testament to resilience as much as to tragedy. America's calculus. For the United States, the bombing campaign was seen as both victory and necessity. Military planners believed the alternative, an invasion of Japan, would have cost millions of lives on both sides. By unleashing firebombs and atomic bombs, they sought to end the war swiftly. Curtis LeMay, reflecting later, admitted, "If we'd lost the war, we would have been tried as war criminals." Yet he maintained the bombings were essential to forcing Japan's surrender. The moral debate endures to this day. The end of the war. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender. Above them, formations of B-29s and carrier planes roared overhead, a final demonstration of America's overwhelming air power. The war was over. The world had changed forever. Epilogue. From ashes to renewal, the collapse of Japanese industry under B-29 bombing raids was not simply a military defeat, it was the destruction of a system. In less than a year, America had dismantled the empire's capacity to make war. Cities were gone, transportation shattered, and morale destroyed. Yet in the decades to come, Japan would rebuild, guided by a new constitution and supported by American aid. From the ruins of Tokyo rose skyscrapers. From the ashes of Hiroshima rose peace monuments. The country that had once been crushed by B-29s would become a symbol of peace and prosperity. But the memory of 1945 remains. The nights when the sky rained fire, the mornings when cities were gone, the days when industry collapsed, these are reminders of war's cost and of the moment humanity first glimpsed its power to destroy itself.